complex, much too complex.
You're listening to Politics Within Reason, the official podcast of the Party of Reason and Progress. Hey, while you're listening, why not follow us, like, and give us a share?
All right, so we're going to begin today with talking a little bit about mosquitoes. As we've had hurricanes and flooding all across the United States and indeed around the world, with flooding in Bangladesh, typically mosquitoes move in afterwards. So I wanted to talk at least a little bit about mosquitoes. In terms of how to avoid exposure to these disease-carrying parasites, there are three ways to do it. There are three repellents that will keep them off of you. Now, there are two chemicals and there's actually one oil. The chemicals are, of course, DEET, which everybody has heard about. That is the gold standard. You can find it generic. It's very inexpensive. It's safe. It's effective. Picaridin is a little more effective than DEET. It's a newer development. Now, if you need an organic alternative, there's only one natural substance which seems to do the trick. And that's oil of lemon eucalyptus. Strangely enough, that strange-sounding oil actually does repel mosquitoes on the same scale of effectiveness as DEET. I'm not sure it keeps them far enough away. I want to remind everybody, if you live in a flood-prone area, if you are in Texas, if you're in Florida, please be sure to eliminate stagnant water. That's where they breed. If you be sure to overturn any kiddie pools, used tires sitting out in your lawn, anything like that, that's where mosquitoes will breed and spread.
All right. Thanks for that, Sam. I actually saw on Facebook, and I don't know how true this was, but people were showing these mosquitoes just covering everything. Now there's so much water stagnant in the Houston area. These mosquitoes are, really just prolific. Let's get into the news for the week. Last episode, of course, we were talking about DACA. Now it looks like the president has decided not to continue DACA unless he does. But what are the alternatives? Has anyone been looking into that?
Well, I know we had a guest on the show that was talking about some of the alternatives and how that could be structured potentially. And, there's been conversations about whether Congress is actually going to do the right thing for DACA recipients or participants. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I guess even more interesting was to see that Trump kind of went back onto social media, I think probably after a lot of the pushback, and said, hey, if you're a dreamer now, you don't have to be worried. There's no action that we're going to take.
That was really,
right?
Really strange, right? He comes out and says, hey, we're not going to continue this program, but don't worry. Don't worry. It'll be okay. And what we're counting on, right, is Congress to actually act, and they failed in the past.
We have to remember, that statement by Trump came after a conversation with, oddly enough, Nancy Pelosi. And it's strange to hear about the president talking to the House Minority Leader on a subject like this, especially given the partisan rancor that's been in Washington. But it appears that she pressured him or asked him to come out and reassure members of the public, the people benefiting from the DACA executive order, that they will not be immediately deported. And one thing that we should also keep in mind is that DACA was always intended by President Obama to be a stopgap because Congress, as you said, it couldn't act.
They failed to pass the DREAM Act, right? In maybe 2010. Do you remember what year that was?
It's been decades since it was first introduced.
Is Nancy Pelosi a Jedi? I think we have to ask that question. What happened in there?
I think Trump just doesn't give a shit and is tired of dealing with politics. So 2001, August 1st, 2001.
2001. Okay.
So it looks like the DREAM Act was introduced on August 1st, 2001, originally by Dick Durbin and Orrin Hatch. So
it's good to see that Dick Durbin is still pushing for this. He and Graham are pushing a bipartisan bill in the Senate to get the DREAM Act through. And maybe this time they'll have to do it with that deadline looming.
And it has always been bipartisan, so hopefully Congress does act this time.
I think they need to. And, when President Trump came out and said, no action is going to be taken for this time period while it's, suspended or in review by Congress, the president has to say something, right? You have 800,000 people or approximately 800,000 people that, for the most part have lived here their whole life. Some of them may not speak Spanish or, another language from their home country. And I mean, I don't know. Put yourself in that position. Wouldn't you be really concerned?
Yeah, and when you say home country, right, they don't know any other country. They don't remember it. I don't remember what I was doing when I was 6, which is the average age of these people when they first came over.
Yeah, at that point, you're just kids outside playing, on their bikes or going to school or whatever with their friends. And, now you're saying this isn't your country. I mean, I really hope Congress does the right thing. And, it seems like there's a lot of momentum and action that's going to push it in the right direction. I mean, I think here, even in Santa Fe, there's been some protests that happened downtown. I think that was the one this week with the 12 arrests, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's very passionate.
And let's be sure to remember one thing about this. So the DREAM Act beneficiaries, they are not criminals. They don't have a criminal record. Like you said, the average age they come to the U.S. is 6, and they are not eligible for any government benefits. So if somebody's talking about them putting less money into the system than they get out of it, no, that's not true. They pay the same taxes. They both pay the same tax as everybody else does, and they pay $250 a year or $500 every 2 years to renew their work permit to stay here. So not only are they benefiting our government financially, but they are paying a heavy price for being Americans already. So let's not make it any harder for them.
That's right. Yeah. Did you guys see that heartbreaking story about the DACA recipient who drowned trying to save his neighbors out in Houston during the hurricane? Right. These people, this is their community.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of great people that are here.
Yeah, there was a couple paramedics. I'm sure we'll find many more in Florida as Irma comes through who are helping and just being a part of their community.
What I'm really kind of afraid of with this being in the hands of Congress is what is going to get attached to it, and there's a lot of things with immigration now, like the wall. I really would hate to see this become hey, we'll give you this, but we want that instead.
But isn't that how it's supposed to work?
It is. But I mean, this is also, I think, very strategic. And I don't use that word very often with Trump, but I think it's pretty strategic on his part, because this is a way that I think he could reinvigorate the discussion about the wall and actually trying to get it pushed through.
Well, ideally, we'd like to see a clean bill. I think what we're going to see happen is we're going to see Republicans try to tie it to an increase in border security funding, and Democrats might give on that. I don't think that the Democrats are going to allow the funding for the border wall to be included in that. We're going to see Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi probably try to integrate it into spending bills. I'm guessing in 3 months, when the debt ceiling comes up again, that if the DREAM Act hasn't been passed by then they're going to have that as a condition for extending the government's debt ceiling.
Yeah, can you believe that they got that 3-month extension? That was amazing. Pelosi and Schumer, they're not the flashiest people, but wow. To me, at least, it seems like that was a little bit of a win.
So I think this is a news item in and of itself. So, if everybody has heard that's listening to this podcast, the congressional leadership met with Donald Trump last week at the White House to hammer out a agreement for continuing the government's solvency. Basically, the government has been employing extraordinary measures to allow them to both pay their bills and run the government. So they've been delaying payment. They've been taking all sorts of temporary measures to stay solvent, but that is running out, and that's why you've not seen the national debt go up. Push comes to shove, and everybody meets in the White House. Basically, what happens is Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan go in and they say, "Hey, we want 18 months, of extension."
The election. Right.
Yeah,
we want to go past the election.
Yeah, they want to take it past the midterm election so that this never comes up again. Never mind that they were putting Barack Obama and the Democrats through a rigmarole every few months when they were in power. They want to not have to deal with the issue. Now, the issue with the Republicans is they may have the raw votes to pass it, but the Freedom Caucus, the ultra-conservatives, they won't pass it without spending cuts. They will not pay attention to their own party.
Right. They believe in the debt ceiling. They believe it's a real thing that must be respected.
Right. And of course it isn't, because the government has already authorized that spending in the first place.
Absolutely. But, if Congress didn't want to spend that money, they wouldn't have already spent that money.
Exactly. Now, Chuck Schumer comes back, and he's the one leading the discussion. I'm not sure if it was Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi, but the Democrats, they come back and they basically say, no, we're not okay with that. you're going to have to shorten the time. And so then the time is suggests 12 months, 6 months, and then Trump suggests eliminating the debt ceiling altogether. And the Democrats are perfectly fine with that because that's been something that they've been after for the longest time, but the Republicans shoot it down.
And you know what? I agree with Trump on this. I think Trump's completely right. And every president has thought this, rightly so. Eliminate the debt ceiling.
Absolutely.
Don't spend the money if you don't want it to go to that amount.
Yeah, and if you listen to the people who were in the White House under Bush and under Obama, they got incredibly frustrated with it. So Trump takes the Democrats' first offer, essentially, which is a 3-month extension tying the passage of that bill to Hurricane Harvey aid. And the great thing about this, if you are a Democrat, is that you saw about 90 Republicans in the House vote against Hurricane Harvey aid because they were so angry at the president that he basically caved to the Democrats.
Including a couple from Texas and Florida, right? A couple of Republicans from Texas and Florida voted against this aid. I mean, that has to be a gift to the Democrats, I would assume.
It is. And it's, it's a political outmaneuvering of them. So, one thing to keep in mind with this is, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, they played their hand very well. But it's important to keep in mind that they really do have a strong hand in terms of government. The Republican Party is basically a coalition between different competing interests. And if any of those interests diverge, then the Democrats have a great leverage. So if there's somebody listening who's a liberal and is maybe concerned about not being able to influence government direction, don't give up, because legislation takes 60 votes to pass in the Senate, and you need a 50-50 vote in the House, and the Republican House can't get together on any issue.
That's right. This week it happened. This influence actually happened this week from a minority party. And that was because the majority party, as you said, Sam, often finds itself in a minority position because of these diverse coalitions that make it up.
One of the things, though, too, is I think Trump needs a win, right? He hasn't really had that many feathers in his cap.
Yeah. And let's be honest, this was a bit of a win for Trump. This is maybe what people thought Trump could do if you were being very charitable. He could possibly come in and he could figure out what the best deal was supposed to be and make it happen. And yeah, he needs hurricane funding. You can't be the president and not fund relief. That's not going to work.
I'm not saying that it's a win for Trump. What I'm saying is he needed to do abatement from future problems. I mean, you have the 2 hurricanes. The one in Florida doesn't look like it's going to be as bad as the one in Texas, but you put the president in that spot, and now you're going to have deadlock in the debt ceiling, issue. I think he was just willing to accept it so that he didn't have to deal with it.
Well, the other thing is that President Trump has never been somebody who has exhibited an extreme level of patience, and legislative wrangling takes an extreme level of patience. And we've even seen somebody like former President Obama lose his head over it. So, probably what happened is he got tired and he wanted out. And so he took the first agreement that he could assign his name to when it came his way.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what happens in 3 months.
Exactly. Right before the end of the year, right before Christmas, we're going to see another debt crunch.
Yeah. And I think the Democrats are actually playing smart politics here, even though it's not very flashy. I've been reading a book on the Civil War recently, and one of the things they were obsessed about as they were maneuvering in battle was trying to get into what's called interior lines, which is where your army is really bunched together, and the army outside of you, it would be on exterior lines and is attacking you. Well, the army that's in the middle has a shorter communication route, and so they can really go against those army on the exterior. And to me, that's sort of what this looks like. The Democrats are really bunching up because DACA is actually quite popular. Funding the government is very popular. So I think they're in a good position where all these exterior coalitions from the Republicans are going to be attacking one unified group. And I think they had an early win, and we'll probably see that again.
Well, we have to remember that it's always easier to be in opposition rather than to actually try to get things done, especially in a congressional system like the United States. So we saw the Republicans in opposition mode for 8 years, and they were fairly effective doing that. We'll see how the Democrats do going forward. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are both very effective legislators, so I have full confidence in their ability to put their agenda forward and use what influence they have.
And the other bit of news I wanted to get into, if we're done with this topic, is we found out that Facebook sold $100,000 worth of political ad to Russian groups. There was a really good piece in the Rachel Maddow show this week talking about where these groups came from. And it was Russian groups that started to disguise themselves as conservative groups to really support Trump. Fascinating. So this was revealed apparently to Robert Mueller, who is the special prosecutor looking into Russian interference with the election, of course.
Facebook came forward with this data, from what I understood, right? It wasn't like it was something that was discovered. Facebook actually volunteered this information, right?
That's what I understand, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was in a blog post, according to the Washington Post.
Yeah, and that's $100,000 that we know of. And there may have been more, there may have been less, but that allows you to buy a lot of ad time in front of a lot of people. Did it change the election? Maybe, maybe not. But the point is, Russian groups were actively spending money to interfere with the election.
It does. And have you guys ever spent money on Facebook advertisements?
Yes.
Yeah. I think you get about $20 for maybe 8,000 impressions or something like that. Is what it is recently.
It kind of varies on how you do it. But, one thing to keep in mind is that what we're seeing here is that Facebook was always a company which was founded to be very slim. So they don't really have people that are looking at everything. And I think that with the fake news crisis and the subversion of Facebook for Russian political purposes, we are seeing them get serious about ensuring the integrity of their platform, which will be interesting to see going forward.
Well, we're almost certainly going to see it in 2018.
I can point out, like on Facebook ads, I know that there is an approval process, because when I've placed ads, it'll say that your ad is in review. And definitely they've gotten more aggressive with it, because one of my ads wasn't quite to their terms of service or whatever. And they actually suspended my ad account.
Oh, wow.
For a period of time. And I wrote them, I said, why didn't you just deny the ad? Why did you suspend the entire account? And then they eventually unlocked it. But, to put things in perspective, 100K on Facebook is a huge amount of traffic. And
it's in the millions, right? Millions of impressions.
Yeah. Tens of millions of impressions.
Tens of millions,
at the very least. So we're talking about a sizable percentage of America that would have seen this advertisement.
I think if you look at the sense of like Facebook, I don't think that Facebook knowingly did this.
No, of course not.
For them, it's another ad, one out of millions of ads that go through their network every day. But even I know Jason Kalkanis was talking about this specific thing on his Twitter feed today about this ad. And I said, well, if they did know about it, obviously there's a big problem. But, I don't know. Anyone can go on Facebook and place an ad, but it is, it's evidence, you could do it on Google too. Or Instagram, which is obviously Facebook. But in this day and age, everyone has the ability to have a gigantic megaphone if you got the money or if you got the time.
Right. This is this is always the concern of Citizens United. And of course, we have to recognize governments have been interfering with each other's elections for quite a long time. The question that we are faced here is, was it sought after, to actually be assisted by a foreign government? So Facebook's the one that we know about. That almost certainly means there were others, maybe on Facebook, maybe like you said on Google. So we'll see what comes of this investigation.
There's even other avenues too, other than those. You could sponsor blogs and, other types of articles that get syndicated on different networks. Heck, you could even do your own podcast if you wanted to, So I think it's a new form of political warfare.
Part of a Russian, as far as we know, we are not part of Russian psyops. So that's the good news about this podcast.
Yeah, that is good news.
This week in history. Well, this week obviously included Labor Day, which is a lot more than just mattress sales and days off. Labor Day became a federal holiday after federal troops put down the Pullman strike, and the Pullman company made luxury train cars. But one of the things that was a bit insidious about it was that all the workers had to live in company housing, which was another way that companies found to make extra money off their situation. And this was okay for a while, but then the economy crashed in 1890, and Pullman started cutting the wages to keep their company afloat, but they kept the rent the exact same on the company housing. And of course, as you might imagine, that was very problematic and people were having trouble feeding their families. And they went on strike, and the strike led to 30 deaths and millions of dollars in damage. And this prompted our absolute favorite president, Grover Cleveland, to establish the Labor Day holiday. Of course, actually, I don't know much about Grover Cleveland except for Labor Day. So I'll admit that.
Well, while we're talking about Labor Day, I think this kind of dovetails nicely into our next segment, where we're going to talk a little bit more about automation and the economy. There has been some ongoing things, too, even in this year with Foxconn, for example, wanting to build their mega factory out in Michigan.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of chatter.
It ended up in Wisconsin, right? Foxconn?
Was it Wisconsin? But they were talking about it, $10 billion investment to build this factory. And it's been interesting to watch the chatter online about it, because a lot of people are hypnotized thinking that since this huge investment's being made, that it's going to create all of these, high paying jobs in their markets. And, I kind of shy away from that because, one, I've read some other articles saying that Foxconn has made this commitment in the past to other governments and it's never followed through. And more importantly, now that you're talking about what happened with Pullman, well, if you go to Foxconn in China, this is the same thing that they do. They have a whole city, where these people live, work, eat, sleep, get married, and, build products basically for the world.
And the details on the Foxconn deal, since it came up, for anybody who's interested to know, it's a $3 billion incentive package that they're giving Foxconn. The total investment in the plant is $10 billion. So it's a $10 billion facility that's being built in Wisconsin. Now, that is projected to create up to 13,000 jobs, but a more realistic estimate is somewhere closer to 3,000 or maybe more than that. But it's not going to create that many. So if you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars per job in incentives, and then quite a bit of money per created job.
Yeah, I don't know that much about Foxconn directly, other than what you guys probably know and hear in the media, but I find it really hard to believe that a mass production company like that is going to create thousands or tens of thousands of high paid jobs. What I see is you're going to have some really well paid engineers, managers, and then you're going to have a lot of minimum wage jobs that include assembly. Because, when you're talking about currency conversion and products, yes, Foxconn has to pay to ship products, import and export out of the US. Having a facility here may reduce some of those costs, but when your production costs are so insignificant in comparison to producing in the US, I don't see how it's going to work out in our favor.
Yeah, it's that old question of, well, the US jobs did get shipped overseas, but what happens when those jobs get shipped back to an American robot? And, the Foxconn plant will almost certainly feature huge amounts of automation, right? And it should. That makes sense. It'll help them stay competitive. And if they didn't do it, somebody else would. So that brings us to the deep dive this week. Sam, do you want to introduce it for us?
Right, guys. So we're going to be talking about fully automated luxury gay space communism, which is mostly a joke. But basically what we're going to be talking about here is what happens with the ongoing march of automation in our economy. Specifically, we've got coming up self-driving vehicles and further automation of everything that's already started, from cashiers to delivery to manufacturing to warehouse work. That's all slowly becoming automated in our economy.
Yeah, it's coming faster and faster every day. Growing up, we all watched the Jetsons and things like that, right? But the future is here. We can see on YouTube and on the internet in general. A couple of years ago, iRobot came out with Roomba that would vacuum your house. And of course, I ran out and bought it. And of course, it clogged up with dog hair after 10 minutes. But, now they have...
the future wasn't quite there.
The promise wasn't there yet, but the idea was, right? And now they have Roomba for your yard that's going to, that promises to keep it weed-free. The self-driving car technology, obviously with Tesla and everyone else is in that race. Even Amazon, I saw a startup that's working with Amazon for using computer vision in retail so that you don't even have to check out. It sees what you pick up, what you put down, and you walk out the store and you're charged. So, these jobs and automation, they are on the way to replace people. And I was thinking about this today when I was reading over the show notes about this was, we are witnessing the next transition in human civilization.
The third industrial revolution, you could say.
Yes. And what were people thinking about before that went through this transition? I mean, growing up, we had AOL and, the internet, and now we're going to see all this automation technology, and the human workforce is going to become less and less required. Some of our guests in our other shows, too, I think have talked about universal basic income. Mark Zuckerberg's come out and talk about it. There's some other countries that are actually doing it. It's unavoidable. We're going to have to do it. Governments they're not very proactive. They seem to be very reactive. Yeah. So what's going to happen? How do we get to a point where our governments and our businesses are going to be mindful that this is coming and that something needs to be done? And how do we make something happen ahead of that curve? I mean, we can't even get things right on climate change.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. You brought up what were people thinking about while everything was happening. And, you guys know who John Maynard Keynes is, right? I mean, he's pretty much the father of modern economic theory. So he actually believed that with the ongoing march, obviously not at that time of automation, but mechanization, at that time he was observing the development of the assembly line and all of these labor enhancements. He actually thought that a 15-hour work week would become the world standard because of declining necessity to have humans actually doing things.
So do you think that's a better idea than just paying people to pursue their hobby, is maybe give everyone a 15-hour work week?
I have no idea. I just thought it was interesting that John Maynard Keynes thought that all the way back in the early 20th century.
So is there a devil's advocate here, right? So we all know, of course, looking in hindsight, everyone at the onset of every industrial revolution thought, oh no, this is going to really upend everything. And it did. But ultimately, they started providing more jobs. And they were jobs that were maybe better jobs that you weren't just toiling on the farm all day. People who were smart could actually go do something else. They could build trains, or they could build bridges or airplanes. Is that going to happen here?
Here's my concern to that. Throughout human civilization, we've seen labor enhancements, but we've never seen labor replacement. So what I mean by that is we've seen the invention of something like the fully mechanized assembly line, where one worker is installing one part on one Model T. He's doing the same action over and over and over again, and that drives down the cost of that vehicle to a point where everybody can afford it. But at the same time, people thought that was going to drive down the need for work. But what ended up happening is everyone increased their consumption, so the same demand for labor persisted. However, we have never seen a society where labor became less necessary for the basics. And what I mean by that, 40 years ago, we used to see coal mines run by thousands of people individually mining. Now it's about 5 or 6 people running a machine that guts the top of a mountain, and that produces the same amount of materials. It's the same thing with other kinds of mining. We're looking at basically what's happening with automation is it's raising the floor for meaningful entry into the economy in terms of your skills. And it's eliminating jobs progressively the lower down you go in terms of the skill ladder. And the concern is that eventually we get to a point where a very significant portion of society cannot acquire the skills because they do not have the inherent talent in order for them to be able to enter the economy in a meaningful way. So I actually have a little bit of insight into this situation. I used to work at a Ford dealer, and I currently work at Robert Bosch LLC, which is the aftermarket division of Bosch, the largest auto parts supplier in the world. I see quite a bit of information professionally about vehicle automation. My company has actually just purchased a steering company so that they would have all the components they need in order to manufacture a complete kit for a vehicle automation system that they can then market to automobile manufacturers. So, kind of what we're looking at is we're looking at the incremental development of these vehicles. And we're seeing 2 basic types that are on the road right now. And one is what we're seeing with the Tesla and some other vehicles. I think Volvo has one currently too that you can drive over in Sweden, where it is a semi-autonomous vehicle that is capable of driving on the freeway only. So it's basically like a very smart cruise control that will take you to the exit that you want to go to and respond to basic emergency situations. The second type of vehicle that is being developed, and this is the one that actually is a little more complex. Google is working on this, as well as Ford. Some other companies are developing vehicles like this, where it's a neighborhood vehicle. And eventually they're going to iterate that up so that it's capable of driving in more complex and more complex and more complex situations. So you'll take it on residential byways, you'll take it on avenues, you'll program it to merge in and off the highway, and then from that neighborhood car, you'll have it merge in with the semi-autonomous technology that we already have, and you'll have a fully automated vehicle where you can tell it to take you across the United States, and it'll do it.
Yeah, I've heard anecdotal evidence they were trying to get buses to do this, but the buses would hard brake when they saw people getting too close, and they were knocking people over. So we're obviously iterating, but we laugh right now, but it's going to happen.
It will happen.
And so since this is a political podcast, do you think there'll be room for a party that takes extreme measures, such as I saw India was proposing banning self-driving cars to preserve jobs? Do you think that would be a popular idea in the United States? We've seen trying to preserve coal jobs, right?
You have people who, for the most part, obey traffic rules and signage and things like that. I mean, obviously,
in India, you're lucky if
right?
you have signage.
Yeah, in India, there may be signage. It's not going to matter. I mean, you have people coming down the wrong way of the road, driving without headlights. Put it this way: if you were in a city of India trying to drive, you took that traffic to the U.S., we would have the National Guard deployed like in probably 30 seconds. It's unreal. I mean, you might have 4 or 5 people sitting on a motorcycle. So I don't know. I mean, banning it, they can ban it. I don't think it would work there to begin with, anyways, because unless it was all 100% automated, and that's not going to happen there.
Unless everyone is required to.
What you'd do is you'd make the vehicles have their own roads. I mean, that's the only way you could do it.
Pretty much. Yeah.
But would it work in the U.S., do you think, to run this anti-AI party?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. We like our shiny toys.
Yeah,
I think we're going to see elements of both Democratic and Republican parties that are going to start being very concerned about this. And you know who I'm talking about. It's just kind of the jobs and economic justice wings of both parties. So you've got a subsection of Bernie Sanders supporters who are talking about economic inequality. That's going to become a talking point. I don't know if, it's ever going to progress to the point where the Democrats are going to significantly advocate for a ban, but, taxes, who knows? But, certainly that we see the rhetoric right now coming out of the Republican Party and what they're becoming in terms of protecting dying industries, coal mining, steel work in the U.S., et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I should say dying or mostly obsolete industries because we're always going to need steel.
But becoming very automated, right? These industries that have really, as you were talking about earlier, automated themselves to a place where the coal industry employs less people than Arby's, right? That's the famous little statistic right now.
Yeah, but
it still employs a lot of people, but
with steel specifically, it's actually something mostly that's been offshored because labor is cheaper over there, energy is cheaper overseas, environmental regulations are lower. It just doesn't make much sense to make steel here. We make things from steel, and then that's what we do with steel. But that's kind of an aside.
Here's the thing: I think you can do things to maybe slow it down. It's not going to be unavoidable. I mean, 20 years ago, did you think that we would be privatizing the space industry? And automation's already in use in farming and stuff like that. It's going to become more prevalent everywhere. Really, what we got to kind of figure out is how are we going to transition economies? I mean, you're almost working towards, the beginning of what people have studied as a utopia, right? Where, humans don't have to work because you're going to have those people. And then you're going to have more economic divide because you're going to have people who have the skills to build the software, to do the engineering, to make this automation happen. But then you're going to have 90% of the population that doesn't have employable skills because everything's done for you.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on the point here. And what we didn't have before was when the economy grew, those people were helping grow the economy. But what happens when the economy keeps growing, but people aren't part of that piece that's growing the economy? They're not part of that equation.
They grab their pitchforks and get angry. That's what happens.
Yeah, historically, that's what happens. Yeah,
they elect Donald Trump. That's what happens. So one thing I wanted to say then, we're progressing towards a society where labor is not necessary for the production, the distribution, or the sale and delivery of goods. And we have never been in a society where labor was not significantly involved in that process. What happens when we move beyond unskilled labor, when the only way people can contribute to the economy is if they're in upper level sales, if they're, an engineer, if they're a scientist, if they're an intellectual of some kind? There's always going to be people who just do not have the mental capabilities to do that. I mean, I can't do calculus. So, I just have an inability to do calculus. So otherwise I would be trying to be an engineer or a scientist. But that's going to be a situation a lot of people are going to run into.
Maybe this is our opportunity to actually focus on things that matter. Hey, let's clean up the environment. Let's focus on an actual cure for diseases that has plagued the humankind. Now, granted, a lot of those things are going to be outside of the purview of people's skills and talent. But if you talk about like pollution cleanup, like I think that's something that we could rally behind with a lot of people and say, hey, we're going to sort through this garbage. We're going to recycle this stuff. We're going to clean up our home. I mean, that's, I think, where we're going to have to head to, because we can run from this all we want. It's going to happen.
Let anybody who wants to have a job get a job. And that may come back to these interesting and innovative tax schemes that we're sort of alluding to here. Do you tax the robots so that people can get paid to go clean up streams? And that may be a great idea.
If you move beyond the necessity of labor for the manufacture and the distribution of goods, it becomes difficult to imagine a universe with anything other than the economic structure of Star Trek or Death Race 2000. I don't know if either of you if you have watched that particular gem, but basically in Death Race, the unemployment rate is 99%, and everybody sits on their couch all day and watches VR stuff in their headset. We're progressing towards an outcome where we need to make some difficult decisions. And so that everybody knows just how many jobs are going to be affected by this. Since I work in the automobile industry and my job is I deal with mechanics and auto parts people all day long. I want to kind of go through the jobs that are going to be impacted by vehicle automation. I'm going to divide them into first, second, and third order job losses or job automations. So we start out with the direct replacement. And I think everybody has thought truck drivers, right? I mean, long haul semi-truck drivers are probably going to be some of the first jobs to be significantly automated by this.
As we saw in Logan, right? The movie. I thought that was a pretty good depiction of what we'll probably end up seeing.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen Logan, basically it was a flatbed where there was no cab and it was just zooming along on the highway without any resemblance to a modern vehicle. It was actually kind of cool. I mean, they put some thought into it. So, but beyond the semi-truck drivers, think about taxi and Uber or Lyft rideshare drivers. Uber and Lyft are both actually working on integrating self-driving vehicles into their operations.
They even have their own research programs, right? They're not just passively doing this. They are trying to make it happen. That's the only way they're profitable.
And they're going to make it happen. I believe, if memory serves me correctly, that both Uber and Lyft have automobile companies that have invested into them. I think it's GM that has invested into Uber specifically for that purpose, so that Uber could use GM's technology while doing automation, and that GM could own a piece of that market when everything goes into that.
Yeah, Uber Ford is testing already out on the East Coast.
Yep, and Ford is working on a competitor to both Uber and Lyft, which would use self-driving vehicles, and that's in the research and development stage. But so let's also think about mass transit drivers. So you have bus drivers and the people that right now drive subway cars, rail cars, any other mass transit vehicles. Think about how a traditional city bus would run, or a bus system would run, if you don't need drivers in it every day. You could maintain the same level of service at every time of day. So there's going to be a massive incentive to do that. And eventually there is going to be a system where we look at even replacing bus routes with an on-demand ad hoc network of vehicles, maybe passenger vans or something similar that will just shuttle people between destinations. We've also got food delivery, so pizza delivery, package delivery, couriers, that sort of thing. The post office is probably going to start going to driverless vehicles. And then garbage pickup. Think about how many garbage men are in the United States right now.
Sam, just in those few examples there, and that's a huge part of an economy.
Well, it doesn't end there either, because that's just the jobs that will be immediately automated when we have effective and reliable self-driving cars. So here's my prediction with second-order job losses. You have basically everything depending on the transportation industry. So you have rural gas stations, companies that specialize in doing mechanic work for taxi companies, rural truck stops, restaurants outside the cities. And there's all sorts of companies that depend on that amount of traffic going down the interstate. And then the third major effect that I want to talk about on this country is a worry about what happens to private vehicle ownership when a service like Lyft and Uber becomes competitively automated to the point where owning a vehicle is significantly more expensive than paying for the use of an automated shuttle. If you can either own a car, pay insurance on the car, pay maintenance and gas in that vehicle, or electricity by that point in time, or you can hit a button on your phone and it can take you 50 miles for $10. What are you more likely to do? You're probably going to do the math and get rid of your car, right?
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's very likely.
Especially in urban settings, which we know are going to become even more prevalent as time goes on. But I mean, like when I lived in Washington and Seattle, I had a car and it was like the biggest waste of money because it was like I either walked or I took public transportation. And
absolutely.
Now, if you have the ability, I mean, you do have the ability now, even with Uber and Lyft, to do that. I don't know if it's at the price point where it makes sense to, get rid of my car, but I've used Uber, especially on traveling and stuff like that. But that's an interesting perspective because now you have, we talked about this automation stuff. What about all these people that are reliant on Uber and Lyft as another form of income? And I know there's math out there that shows that it's not necessarily always a great deal to be an Uber driver when you consider the cost of car ownership. Right. But they're working off cash flow, right? They're generating cash flow. What happens to that whole market?
They're meaningfully participating in their economy, and it's not a great deal to be a rideshare driver, but you are earning enough to make a living. And here's the other thing, too. Think about what happens when car ownership declines and the use of the vehicles that are on the road decline. How many car dealerships do you guys pass? How many mechanic shops do you guys pass? Right. Firestone Tires, Goodyear, everything like that. If what happens is collective ownership of these vehicles replaces private ownership of these vehicles, you have a corporate fleet instead of individual ownership. And that means a central maintenance depot instead of a unified sales, delivery, maintenance operation. You don't need auto parts stores. You don't need auto parts delivery. You don't need anything relating to that. You don't need salesmen. You don't need lot porters. You don't need mechanics. Think about all the jobs that depend on private ownership of the vehicles. And, I'm not saying that we need to get in the way of vehicle automation. That we need to prop up industries which become obsolete. We don't need to do that. But we should put a little effort into thinking about what happens when all of these industries become obsolete and everybody who has always relied on them no longer has any way to participate in the economy.
It may be as simple as vehicle automation that creates a tumbling of the economy to where we actually have to act quickly because of all those contingent industries. I mean, and not just those industries, but the consumers, the employees in that market are consumers in our economy. And now they're not going to be enabled to be consumers because they don't have a job.
And the problem is many of those industries, it's not something where people are likely going to have a secondary skill set where they can just transition into something else.
That's what's been interesting about interviewing some of these candidates for Congress, this guy, Dennis Dinge, who we interviewed from Albuquerque, he suggested that what we ought to do is not make all college free, but make any kind of training that's in demand free. And the idea then was that, you could rapidly adjust, hopefully, the workforce. Recent science. All right, guys, do you think you're still evolving or are you stuck?
Oh, I think we're definitely evolving. Genetic drift stops for nobody.
That's right. Well, you're absolutely right. There's been a massive study in PLOS biology that was highlighted earlier this week. We'll post a link to it on our Facebook page. But researchers looked at DNA from 215,000 people and tracked 8 million mutations to see which genetic changes were changing in frequency. And they found that a number of genes, especially one of the ones that predisposes you to Alzheimer, were becoming more uncommon in older people, even though they actually don't seem to affect your ability to reproduce. So anyways, we are still evolving. It's kind of an interesting study.
Hey Nation, we want to hear from you, our listeners. So go ahead and reach out to us on Facebook or give us a call at 202-681-2274. We might even play you on the show. Politics Within Reason is a project of the Party of Reason and Progress, a registered 527 political organization. Don't forget to rate us on iTunes or whatever you use to listen to your podcasts. Thanks for your support, and until next week, this is Politics Within Reason.